Hello YouTube, Jerry Kirkpatrick here. So the last video, video number 2 on how to use the radius turning tool, we made the concave die, and this time we'll be making the convex die. We're just going to put one radius on one side, so the top die will fit right down into the bottom die and create a roll. Usually these are called tank rolls. They're used when you're making a tank, like a dry sump tank, and you have two pieces coming together. You put a quarter of a radius on one side, a quarter of a radius on the other, and then make the weld. And then when that is dressed off, you think it's all one piece. So before we get over on the lathe, there's a couple of things I'd like to address. One is the handle that is on my radius turning tool. It's about 10 inches long. The first 3 inches are just a 3/8 bolt that's bolted right into the radius block, and behind that is a piece of 1x1 angle iron that's been twisted, and because it's me, I put a leaf on the end of it. The other thing that I neglected to mention was a small piece of foam that I stuffed down into the groove that's cut for the compound to ride in, where it's tightened down. The next thing I'd like to talk about is on the radius tool itself. So let's go over to the lathe, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So what I want to approach is the way that I have my tool offset, and the purpose for that is this washer and the rotating bolt, the bolt that holds the rotating block down. Most of the radius turning tools that you see, they've got the head right over the center where the compound would be. By doing that, you have to have your whole carriage much closer to the piece, and that causes sometimes interference in this area. By having this offset from this edge, then I can keep my carriage back. It's still stiff, and I can make it radius without having to have everything all in one bunch. So let me get this bolted back down, and I'll be back in just a moment. So on the concave die, I had the mandrel out a little bit farther. So I'm going to move it back in because all of the cut is going to be towards the outside. So I'll move the mandrel in. Install the die. Well, actually at this point it's a blank, isn't it? That's tight enough. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is remove the piece that's used for the concave cutting. And if you notice, this is a full 3/4 by 1. the one that'll be used for cutting convex, I have cut this portion down here slightly, and the reason for that is the distance from the top of this to the top of the tool bit, the insert. That is the maximum radius I can turn, and I designed it for this distance because most of the dies that I will be making are for the bead roller, and I know my dies aren't going to be much larger than this 2.5 that I'm turning here. So I'm going to set that in place. And this little piece of angle iron is what I'll do the adjustments with. And I drilled and tapped it so I don't lose these little screws for holding it to the radius turning tool. I got that tight. So the material that we'll be rolling in this set of dies is 18 gauge, which is 049. So I'm leaving a 50 thousandths gap in between these two dies to make up for the material that will be formed in the die. So this die is going to be 70 thousandths radius, or 700 thousandths radius, instead of the 750 like this one. So now I've got to set my cutting tool to 700 thousandths. So in order to do that, I have a 700 thousandths spacer here. I'll just move this back, put that up against it, tighten the locking screws, and now I'm going to be turning exactly a 700 thousandths radius. Okay, so before we get to cutting, I'm going to put some dicum on the outside of this piece. And one, it's so it'll give you a little contrast so you can watch the cut as it progresses. And two, I'm going to make a mark at 700 thousandths. Okay, so we've got the dicum dried on there. I want to make a line at 700 thousandths, which will be the depth of the cut. And if you notice with this set of calipers, I've ground this one back so I can touch on the movable jaw here, and that allows me to keep the calipers straight instead of having to hold it at an angle like I had to on the other one. And you can see that there is a space back here, so let's move that jaw forward. Okay, we've got the mark on there. Now to adjust the position of the arbor or the die in the lathe itself, I'm going to set this so it is perpendicular to this face, bring it in to a point where I'm comfortable. I know that the lathe, the jaws are not going to hit, so I'm going to tighten that down, loosen that, and just bring this arbor out until it touches. Now I know that the radius I'm going to cut when the handle or this bit is touching this face and it comes all the way around here, I'll be able to see this scratch mark. So I'm going to back the tool out. I don't want to take too much. If you remember on the last one, I took about 10/1000ths at a swipe, and that's what I'm going to do with this. So we're ready to start cutting. Oh, and before I get to cutting, I have about 1/8 of an inch between the bottom of the die and the top of this, and that distance for making these dies is how I arrived at this height when I drew this tool up. Okay, once again, we can see that the line that I'm heading towards is right here, and I've got just a small amount of blue between that scribe line and where the radius terminates. So at this point, I'm not going to move the handle at all, and just make probably a couple of cleanup passes and see how I come out to that line. I'm moving much slower than I have been previously. So I think I'm there. I don't see any of the line here, so I'm just going to move in 1/1000 and come back out very slowly and get the finest cut I can. Once my tool bit is straight in, if I go past this, it'll start making that radius on the back side. I think I'm going to go in another thou. Slowly to make sure the cut is as good as it can be as it comes off the mandrel. So I am there. Loosen the carriage. Get this out of the way. Wipe that down. Let me get some Dicom on here and I'll be right back. Alright, now that the Dicom is dry, I'm going to use the flexible file again and we'll see how smooth this is. Okay, I can see it's just a little low right there. I can blend this in and then probably just with a file, maybe even a air tool, finish that off and we'll be done. So let me get this off of the lathe and I'll meet you back over at the table. So that was a fun-filled afternoon, wasn't it? Here is the first die, the Concave. And if you remember, there was a little turn up here. The center of this radius is right in this area. So after that point, this starts to rise, but this one fits just perfectly down in there. If this was smoothed out, you couldn't fit a piece of paper in there. So the tank rolls are a fairly common piece used in metal shaping. I've made several, but I've got a set from Ron Covell, and they fit just like this. He has them on Trick Tools is where you can buy them. They're made for a specific machine, but you can also buy shims that will make them fit any machine that you have. And they come in 5/16, half, 1 inch, and 1.5 inches. So if you go to Trick Tool, and they're called round over dies. So you can do a search in that way. Okay, well, this has been a fun series, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe. We'll see you later.